Hey guys, tonight we're setting the table, quite literally, for one of the strangest rituals of the 19th century, the Victorian dinner party. Picture yourself stepping into a grand townhouse lit by flickering gas lamps, the faint scent of roast beef mingling with perfume and cigar smoke. You're holding an invitation so thickly embossed and perfumed that it could double as a weapon. And trust me, you probably won't survive this story without yawning at least once, so don't fight it, lean into it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly soothing to see where and when everyone else is drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The envelope in your hand feels like a work of art. Heavy paper, gilt edges, and calligraphy that looks like it was penned by someone with far too much time and an excellent quill. Invitations like this weren't simply about asking you to dinner, they were social declarations. Who you dined with mattered almost as much as what you ate. A dinner invitation could elevate your standing or signal your exclusion, and in the dance of Victorian society, missing the right card on the mantel could mean months of whispered questions. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Formal dinner invitations were often sent weeks in advance and could not be refused lightly. Declining an invitation without a solid excuse risked social offense, and your absence would almost certainly be noted and discussed. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some hosts actually perfumed their invitations so heavily that recipients complained about headaches. One poor soul wrote in his diary that opening an envelope was like being embraced by a lavender bush in full rebellion. Imagine dozing off mid-meal while your nostrils still tingle from eau de violets. Historians still argue whether these elaborate invitations were primarily practical tools, ensuring the right mix of guests, or thinly veiled social weapons used to signal who was in and who was very much out. Some suggest invitations were even designed to intimidate with their excessive flourish. You slip the card back into its envelope, and can almost feel the judgment radiating from its gold leaf. The sensory details of this moment are vivid, the scratch of the wax seal as you crack it, the faint perfume puffing into your nose, the texture of thick cardstock beneath your fingertips. Even the way your name is written, half art, half threat, makes you stand straighter. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine an exhausted butler carrying a stack of invitations muttering, "If I see one more gilt border, I'll gild myself." You tuck the card away, nerves buzzing. You're not just going to dinner. You're stepping into a world where every gesture, every seat, every word is a performance, and your invitation is the first line in the script. You stand before the mirror, invitation tucked neatly on the dresser, and realize that merely showing up is not enough. At a Victorian dinner party, your clothing is part of your admission ticket, a silent resume stitched into fabric and lace. The evening doesn't begin at the table, it begins in front of the wardrobe, where you wrestle with layers of etiquette before you've even left the house. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Proper attire for Victorian dinners was strictly codified. Gentlemen wore black evening coats with tails, crisp white shirts, and perfectly tied cravats. Ladies donned elaborate gowns with gloves, corsets, and often headdresses or tiaras if their rank permitted. Arriving underdressed wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a social calamity that could haunt your reputation for months. You tug at a cravat, fumbling with its folds, the knot refusing to resemble anything beyond a wrinkled napkin. Your valet sighs, muttering about how the waterfall knot is out of style this season. Across the hall, you hear your neighbor's maid yanking on a corset until her mistress squeaks like a squeezed bellows. The house fills with the orchestral groans of fashion, each squeak and grunt a note in the symphony of preparation. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some gentlemen hired special, cravat consultants, whose sole business was teaching men how to tie their neckwear correctly. One London wit claimed these consultants caused more anxiety than surgeons, since a botched operation might be forgiven, but a crooked cravat was social suicide. Imagine explaining to your doctor that you survived surgery but died of embarrassment at supper. Historians still argue whether Victorian dress codes reflected genuine practicality, warmth, modesty, uniformity, or whether they were simply instruments of social control. Did layers of silk and starched collars reinforce status? Or did they merely keep tailors and laundresses in endless employment? Scholars note both sides, debating whether the corset was empowerment through elegance or oppression through discomfort. The sensory details of your preparation are overwhelming. You smell starch and lavender soap, feel the pinch of polished boots around your ankles, hear the faint creak of whalebone corsets tightening in other rooms. The candlelight gleams off silk, catches on cufflinks, and transforms even nervous glances into little performances of confidence. Every swish of skirt or snap of glove feels rehearsed, like actors backstage before the curtain rises. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine someone sighing. "At least the soup will be warm." Another replies, tugging at a corset string. "Unlike me." By the time the carriage arrives, you're armored in fabric, trussed up like a roast, and half wondering if you'll be able to breathe through the entire meal. But as you step into the night, the gas lamps glowing, you know your outfit has spoken before you've said a single word. The performance has already begun. The carriage wheels crunch softly over cobblestones, lanterns bobbing as you near the grand townhouse glowing with gaslight. You can already hear the muffled swell of voices, laughter, and the faint tinkling of piano keys inside. But before you even cross the threshold, you know the evening has rules, and one of the strangest parts of a Victorian dinner party is the way arrivals were staged like a carefully choreographed ballet. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Guests were expected to arrive within a precise 15-minute window of the time printed on the invitation. Arriving too early risked catching the host unprepared. Arriving too late was seen as an insult. Punctuality signaled respect, but more importantly, it confirmed that you understood the unspoken code of social timing. The butler greets you at the door, face expressionless but eyes sharp enough to measure your entire reputation in a glance. He takes your cloak with a practiced sweep, then subtly adjusts the order in which you'll be announced. That announcement is not casual, it's your moment of entry, like stepping onto a stage. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some butlers intentionally mispronounce names of unpopular guests as a form of subtle sabotage. Imagine entering a glittering drawing room only to be introduced as Mr. Snodgrass, when you are, in fact, Mr. Snodgraves. The ripple of suppressed chuckles would haunt you for months. One pert colonel was supposedly reintroduced 3 dinners in a row as General. He never received a 4th invitation. Historians still argue whether these rituals of greeting were genuine hospitality or just status theater. Was the bow at the door a warm welcome or an early ranking ceremony? Some accounts describe guests feeling flattered and elevated. Others confess to a chill of judgment the moment they handed over their coat. The sensory details of this threshold are vivid. You hear the heavy thunk of the front door closing behind you, shutting out the cold night. The air inside is warm, scented with roast meats and beeswax polish. Gaslight flickers against mirrors, multiplying reflections until the hallway feels crowded even before you see another guest. The floor muffles your steps with thick carpet, but the murmur of voices grows louder, promising the crowded room ahead. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine someone tripping over the threshold and muttering, "Better to fall at the start than fall in the soup." You bow or curtsy in the hall, exchange quick pleasantries with the host, and move toward the drawing room. Already you sense the careful arrangement of power, the order of arrivals, the angle of bows, the warmth of greetings. The dinner hasn't started yet, but the game is well underway. You follow the flow of guests deeper into the house, past gilt mirrors and velvet drapes, until you reach a small table where a neat stack of calling cards glimmers like tiny passports. A footman discreetly nudges you forward, and you realize this is no trivial detail. This is the map of the evening, the web that decides your fate before the soup even arrives. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Calling cards were central to Victorian social life. Guests left them at houses to signal visits, and at dinner parties, they were used to manage introductions and confirm social standing. Alongside this, seating plans were meticulously drawn up by the host, with every chair a subtle declaration of who mattered most, who was tolerated, and who was practically invisible. You glance down at the polished silver tray. Cards are embossed with crests, monograms, or flourishes that look like tangled vines. A servant discreetly slides your card into the pile, and you feel a small but undeniable flutter. Will your place at the table prove flattering or humiliating? Here's the quirky tidbit. Some hosts deliberately placed rivals or ill-matched personalities side by side to stir polite sparks. A gossip-prone dowager beside a tight-lipped bishop, or a boisterous colonel next to a painfully shy spinster. The entertainment wasn't just the food. It was watching the table strain under carefully arranged tension. Imagine being seated between two men who had argued about railway shares for a decade, and being told to keep the conversation lively. Historians still argue whether these seating rituals served harmony or drama. Did hosts genuinely aim to balance conversation, or did they relish creating tiny stages for conflict and intrigue? Some scholars insist seating was strategic diplomacy. Others think it was covert entertainment for bored elites. The sensory details of this ritual seep into you. You smell ink and wax from the cards, see the flicker of candlelight across gilt-edged names, hear the hushed rustle of paper as servants whisper and adjust. When the dinner gong eventually booms, you glance at the chart pinned discreetly on the wall, names carefully matched with numbered places. It's less a menu and more a social chessboard. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine one exasperated hostess sighing, "If I seat the bishop by the actress, I'll never hear the end of it, but if I don't, I'll never hear the end of it either." When the doors open to the dining room, you already know that your evening is not your own. You are being placed, staged, and positioned, a pawn in the elaborate etiquette of the Victorian table. The gong has sounded, the double doors creak wide, and you drift forward with the rest of the procession, shoes muffled by thick carpets as the dining table glows ahead like an altar. Before you even sit, though, you're reminded that the Victorians didn't just feast. They performed rituals of cleanliness and propriety that seem half common sense, half curious theater. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Hand-washing before the first course was not merely polite but almost ceremonial. In some grand houses, servants circulated with silver basins and pitchers, offering each guest the chance to rinse fingers before the soup arrived. While soap was not always present, rosewater or lavender-scented water often was, ensuring that everyone's hands smelled faintly like a perfumery before lifting a spoon. You extend your hands as a footman tips a pitcher, cool water spilling over your fingers into a bowl below. A linen napkin is offered, starched crisp, and you dab delicately as if you've just touched something scandalous rather than the door handle. Guests murmur thanks, nodding gravely at one another, as though the entire fate of the meal hinges on this watery rite. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some households provided finger bowls between courses, tiny glass dishes filled with warm water and floating petals. The problem? Guests who didn't know the custom occasionally drank from them, mistaking them for odd little soups. One particularly embarrassed politician in London reportedly downed his finger bowl with gusto, then wondered aloud why the broth lacked seasoning. That story circulated for months, long after the petals had wilted. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuine attempts at hygiene in an era before germ theory took full hold, or whether they were mainly symbolic gestures, displays of refinement rather than practical cleanliness. Some scholars suggest that hand-washing was more about the performance of being civilized than about avoiding illness. The sensory details of this moment linger with you. The scent of rosewater rises faintly from your palms, mingling with beeswax polish from the furniture. The linen is crisp against your fingertips, leaving a whisper of starch. The clink of glass bowls, the soft splash of water, the murmured thank yous, all of it feels like the overture to a performance, delicate and rehearsed. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a guest whispering, "If I wash any more, I'll arrive at dessert with no skin left." By the time the soup tureen is carried in, steaming and fragrant, your fingers are not only clean but ceremonially consecrated. You glance around the table and realize that every small act here, every rinse, every dab, every raised eyebrow, is as much part of the meal as the food itself. The soup has arrived, steaming in silver tureens, ladled carefully into bowls that gleam beneath the chandelier. At first glance, you think fine, just soup. But as soon as the spoons touch the broth, you realize you're not here to eat, you're here to perform. Every sip, every gesture is part of a choreography rehearsed by generations of anxious Victorians. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian dining followed an intricate code of utensil use. The rule of thumb was, outside in, begin with the cutlery farthest from your plate, moving inward course by course. Soup was to be spooned away from you, never toward your lips, and slurping was considered unforgivable. The expectation was that dozens of people could eat in near silence, as if the food itself had been trained in etiquette. You take your spoon carefully, dip away from yourself, and raise it with exaggerated steadiness. Around you, the table is eerily synchronized, dozens of hands moving in the same rhythm, like an orchestra of soup eaters. No one speaks yet. The first course demands near total concentration, and the silence is broken only by the faint clink of silver on porcelain. Here's the quirky tidbit. One etiquette manual actually warned that if a lady tilted her soup plate toward herself, her manners tilt with it. Another noted that spilling soup into your lap marked you forever as socially hopeless, no matter how fine your family name. Imagine training for years in conversation, dress, and posture, only to be undone by a single rebellious pea. Historians still argue whether this strict choreography of eating genuinely improved refinement, or simply created anxiety. Was etiquette about creating harmony, or was it a clever mechanism for exclusion, ensuring only the well-trained could feel at ease? Some suggest it brought elegance to the table. Others claim it turned meals into tests disguised as merriment. The sensory world at this moment is intense. You smell nutmeg rising from the broth, hear the faint scrape of spoons gliding in unison, feel the warmth of steam against your face. Gaslight flickers on silver ladles, making them glint like tiny moons, while servants hover at the edges, refilling bowls as quietly as ghosts. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous guest whispering, "If I spill, may I join the servants in the kitchen?" The host, without looking up, might reply, "If you spill, you'll never leave the kitchen." By the time the last spoon is set down, the ritual is complete. Soup is not just consumed but survived, and only now does the room begin to breathe again. Conversation stirs, forks clatter faintly, and you sense that the performance is loosening its grip, but only a little. The dinner has only just begun. The soup plates vanish as if spirited away, and now the true challenge of the evening begins, not with knives and forks, but with words. You glance at your neighbor, summon your politest smile, and realize you're entering the conversational gauntlet of a Victorian dinner party. Talking wasn't freeform, it was its own performance, full of rules more exhausting than the corsets. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Conversation at the Victorian table followed a strict alternation. During the first course, a gentleman was expected to speak with the lady on his right. In the next, he shifted to the lady on his left. The rhythm continued throughout the evening, ensuring that no one was monopolized and that everyone took part in the social exchange. Failing to alternate was seen as either poor manners or worse, favoritism. You turn dutifully to your right and begin with a safe subject, the weather. She nods gracefully, noting the early frost, before steering toward an anecdote about her cousin's pheasant shoot. Later you'll swivel to the lady on your left, who, you're warned, has strong opinions about poetry. The evening begins to feel like a conversational relay race, each turn carefully timed and passed along. Here's the quirky tidbit. Etiquette manuals actually provided sample conversation starters, including gems like, "Do you favor the use of mustard in soups?" Or, "Have you read the latest pamphlet on gas lighting?" Imagine leafing through a guidebook the night before dinner, memorizing lines like a student cramming for an exam. Somewhere in London, a poor soul was probably rehearsing mustard monologues by candlelight. Historians still argue whether this rigid system made dinners smoother or stiffer. Did it ensure inclusivity and balance, or did it stifle genuine spontaneity? Some scholars praise the structure as elegant choreography. Others suggest it turned tables into verbal obstacle courses. Either way, the debate continues, with academics alternating topics almost as faithfully as the Victorians themselves. The sensory details of this conversational ritual are subtle but sharp. You hear the steady clink of forks against plates, punctuating the rise and fall of polite voices. The scent of roasted meats wafts in, distracting you mid-sentence. Gaslight flickers across attentive faces, every nod and smile as rehearsed as your carefully chosen phrases. Even laughter is measured, rippling gently but never swelling into anything unruly. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a guest sighing halfway through, whispering, "I've run out of safe topics." His partner replies, "Then try mustard, it lasts 3 courses." As the plates change and the chairs shift, you realize you've been speaking for nearly an hour without saying anything of consequence. That, of course, is the point. Conversation is less about ideas and more about rhythm, tone, and the reassuring sound of words passing the time as gracefully as the courses glide past your plate. The rhythm of conversation hums on, punctuated by the clatter of cutlery, when a servant glides forward and places a fresh set of glasses at your elbow. The gleam of crystal catches the chandelier's glow, and suddenly you realize you're being tested again, this time in liquid form. The Victorian wine dilemma wasn't about taste. It was about timing and glassware. Here's your mainstream historical fact. At grand dinner parties, as many as 6 or 7 different wines might be served in sequence: sherry with soup, claret with fish, champagne with the roast, port with dessert, and so on. Each had its own glass shape and order. To lift the wrong one at the wrong time was more than a faux pas, it was an indictment of your breeding. You stare at the lineup: tall flute, wide goblet, smaller rounded glass, each arranged like a crystal army. The butler fills them in practiced silence, and suddenly every eye at the table seems to wait for your choice. You glance to your neighbor for reassurance, but she's already sipping with flawless precision. You mimic her movement, and hope no one notices the sweat prickling at your temple. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some hosts, eager to show off their knowledge, served obscure foreign wines with tongue-twisting names. Guests who couldn't pronounce them were politely ignored or quietly ridiculed. One witty observer claimed he survived such dinners by repeating, "Ah, delightful vintage," to every pour, whether it was Bordeaux or something that tasted suspiciously like vinegar. Historians still argue whether these elaborate wine rituals genuinely reflected connoisseurship, or were simply another social gatekeeping device. Were Victorians cultivating refined palates, or just creating more opportunities to judge each other's ignorance? Some insist wine service represented true elegance, others dismiss it as elaborate theater designed to terrify the uninitiated. The sensory details of this course are lush. You smell the dry tang of sherry, the fruity perfume of claret, the tickle of champagne bubbles as they rise in delicate flutes. Crystal glasses ring faintly as they're set down, creating a chiming undercurrent to the soft murmur of voices. The chandelier light refracts through the rims, scattering tiny rainbows across the white linen. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous gentleman lifting the wrong glass and muttering, "Ah yes, port with the fish, just as tradition demands." His neighbor raises an eyebrow and whispers, "A bold move, sir. Revolutionary." By the time the final goblet is drained, you feel pleasantly lightheaded, though less from the alcohol than from the concentration required to survive the ordeal. The meal is far from finished, but the wine ceremony has already proven what you suspected. In this world, you're never simply eating or drinking. You're passing a test, one sip at a time. The clink of crystal fades as the servants glide silently behind you, replenishing plates and adjusting silverware. Yet, while your focus has been on food and drink, something else has been happening all along, an invisible performance woven around you by those who serve. You realize that the servants themselves form a kind of silent ballet, one choreographed as carefully as any waltz in the ballroom. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In grand Victorian houses, footmen, butlers, and maids followed rigid protocols during meals. They moved in prescribed patterns, serving from the left, clearing from the right, and never crossing behind guests in ways that would break the illusion of effortless grace. Their precision was part of the host's display of wealth. The smoother the service, the more impressive the household. You glance down the table and notice how every motion seems rehearsed. Plates appear and vanish as if by sleight of hand. A servant bows just enough to place a dish, then steps back at an identical angle to his fellow on the other side. Even the pouring of wine is done in perfect rhythm, no drop daring to spill on the linen. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some households train their servants to move on the balls of their feet to prevent shoes from squeaking. Others placed felt on stalls or instructed staff to breathe through their noses so heavily they wouldn't sigh audibly. Imagine spending your life mastering the art of not existing, of gliding like a ghost among clattering forks. Historians still argue whether such servant choreography was pure practicality or pure performance. Was it about efficiency in feeding dozens of guests, or was it really about reinforcing the social hierarchy, reminding diners that they floated above invisible labor? Some scholars call it artistry, others call it exploitation wrapped in elegance. The sensory details pull you deeper into the illusion. You catch the faint scent of starch from pressed livery uniforms as a footman passes. The candle flames flicker in a breeze stirred only by their subtle movements. Platters of roast duck arrive with a low, metallic hum of polished covers being lifted in unison. You almost forget that behind this quiet dance lies hours of chopping, boiling, polishing, and shouting in the kitchen below. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous new footman told, "Move like a shadow." He nods solemnly, then knocks over a candlestick, plunging half the table into smoky gloom. As you lift your fork again, you realize that part of the evening's strangeness lies not only in what you do but in what you don't see. The servants' very invisibility is their performance, a vanishing act that makes the dinner feel like magic. And yet you can't help but sense their presence in every polished plate and every silent step. The meal stretches on, the candles burning lower, and at last the great moment of indulgence arrives. The doors swing wide, and servants carry in creations so ornate they look less like food and more like stage props. Dessert in a Victorian dinner party wasn't simply sweet, it was spectacle. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian hosts often competed in dessert theatrics. Elaborate jellies, molded puddings, and iced confections were arranged in towering displays. Sugar work was shaped into castles, pagodas, or animals, often taller than a child. Guests were expected to marvel at these edible monuments before daring to eat them. You lean forward as a pyramid of fruit gleams under the chandelier. Apples and pears are polished until they shine like ornaments, grapes cascade down in careful symmetry, and candied violets glisten like jewels. Another platter reveals a pudding molded into the shape of a fortress, complete with sugar battlements that wobble alarmingly when cut. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some cooks used isinglass, a gelatin made from sturgeon bladders, to give their jellies an almost glassy transparency. One guest described staring through a shimmering tower of jelly and being able to count the buttons on the waistcoat of the gentleman opposite. It's dessert as both nourishment and optical illusion. Historians still argue whether these desserts were genuine expressions of culinary artistry or absurd displays of wealth. Did they demonstrate the refinement of the household, or were they little more than edible bragging rights? Some point to recipe books filled with intricate instructions. Others note the sheer impracticality of building a jelly higher than a footman's knee. The sensory details are vivid. You smell sugar melting into caramel, hear the faint crack of sponge sugar breaking under a spoon, feel the wobble of a jelly trembling on your fork. The room warms with laughter as guests cautiously spear candied fruit, everyone pretending not to notice that the pudding fortress is listing to one side. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a nervous hostess declaring proudly, "The jelly will hold its shape." Seconds later, it collapses into a sticky landslide, and she sighs, "Well, at least it holds its flavor." By the time the plates are cleared, you're full not just of sweets but of spectacle. Dessert has confirmed what the rest of the meal suggested. Dinner in this world is less about sustenance and more about pageantry, each course another act in a long play. And as you lean back, drowsy from sugar, you wonder what curious ritual could possibly follow such a finale. The fortress of pudding has been conquered, the jelly towers subdued, and yet the dinner still has one more trial waiting, the toast. You watch nervously as the host rises, glass in hand, signaling that the most delicate social maneuver of the night is about to begin. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Toasts were common at Victorian dinners, but they weren't casual. They followed a hierarchy. First the monarch, then notable guests, then perhaps the host himself. Rising at the wrong moment, or proposing the wrong subject could mark you as hopelessly ill-bred. Each toast was a miniature performance of loyalty, gratitude, and wit. The host clears his throat, raises his glass of port, and declares in solemn tones a toast to Her Majesty. Everyone murmurs, rises slightly, and sips. Then comes another, this time to a visiting dignitary. Glasses clink softly, the sound like tiny bells echoing down the long table. You grip your glass carefully, aware that even the angle of your elbow is subject to silent judgment. Here's the quirky tidbit. One etiquette manual warned never to clink glasses too hard, as it might crack the delicate crystal and sprinkle monarchs with shrapnel. Another story tells of a nervous guest who, unsure when to drink, kept raising his glass at every pause in the speech, ending up tipsy before dessert was finished. Historians still argue whether the toast was primarily heartfelt or purely ceremonial. Were Victorians truly expressing loyalty and camaraderie, or were they just checking another etiquette box in the endless bureaucracy of manners? Some memoirs insist on the sincerity, others paint the whole ritual as a stiff formality that few enjoyed. The sensory details of this moment are sharp. The room still smells faintly of caramelized sugar, now mingled with the sharper tang of fortified wine. The crystal glasses catch the light of the chandelier, glowing ruby red as they rise in unison. The silence before the first sip is taut, broken only by the soft creak of chairs as guests lean forward together. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a guest whispering, "If I toast any more, I'll need a new liver." His neighbor murmurs back, "At least you'll be remembered, in crystal." When the final toast is made and the glass is lowered, you feel the collective sigh ripple through the room. The ordeal is complete, and yet the evening is not over. Now comes the curious division of company, when conversation splinters along lines as carefully drawn as the seating chart had been. The last toast fades into the air, and with it comes a subtle shifting of the evening. The ladies rise gracefully from their chairs, silken skirts whispering against the carpet, while the gentlemen remain behind, tugging at cuffs and reaching instinctively for decanters of port. You follow the flow, noticing how this divide is as much ritual as anything that came before, the drawing room separation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. At Victorian dinner parties, it was customary for the women to withdraw after the main meal into a separate drawing room, leaving the men to enjoy port, cigars, and often more candid conversation. The separation could last for an hour or more, and rejoining afterward was carefully timed to preserve decorum. You trail behind the ladies into a warm room filled with flowers, faint piano music, and cushioned chairs arranged for graceful conversation. Perfume drifts in the air, the clink of porcelain teacups replacing the clatter of crystal. The conversation here tilts toward novels, theater, or charitable causes. Meanwhile, you imagine the men lingering at the table, voices growing louder, laughter thicker, as smoke from cigars curls into the rafters. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some hosts placed card tables in the men's room, and games of whist or billiards could start immediately after the ladies departed. Meanwhile, the women sometimes amused themselves with gossips so pointed it could have punctured the cigar smoke through the walls. One diarist quipped that the men played cards, the women played characters. Historians still argue whether this ritualized divide reflected genuine preference or enforced constraint. Did women welcome the relief from the men's port-soaked chatter, or did they resent being shunted away while decisions and deals were made in the dining room? Some sources suggest camaraderie in both rooms. Others frame it as the sharpest reminder of gendered roles at the table. The sensory details of the divide are telling. You hear the muffled boom of male laughter from the other room, layered against the gentle notes of a piano etude played in the salon. The air here smells of tea, lavender sachets, and faint perfume, while you imagine the dining room thick with tobacco and brandy. The contrast is stark, two worlds under one roof, separated by more than just a doorway. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a hostess peeking in at the men, wrinkling her nose at the smoke, and whispering, "Perhaps we ladies should stay, at least we'd get the good wine." As the hour wanes, the ritual reconvergence begins. Footsteps echo on the parquet floor as gentlemen shuffle back into polite company, faces a little redder, voices softened. The evening isn't over yet, though. Now it shifts toward another set of performances, this time draped not in etiquette manuals but in music and art. The gentlemen return at last, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and brandy, their laughter carefully toned down to fit the softer air of the drawing room. Chairs are shifted, the piano lid lifted, and you realize the evening isn't winding down, it's shifting into its next act, the musical interlude. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Music was a common feature of Victorian dinner parties and soirees. Guests were often expected to perform, especially young ladies of the household, whose piano playing or singing was treated as proof of both education and refinement. Refusing to participate could be seen as discourteous, while performing badly was, well, unforgettable in the worst way. You settle into a plush armchair as the first notes ripple across the room. A young woman, hands trembling slightly, begins a sentimental ballad about lost love on a moonlit hill. The guests listen with expressions of rapt politeness, some genuinely moved, others stifling yawns. Applause is light but insistent, encouraging the next performer, an enthusiastic gentleman whose violin playing sounds suspiciously like a cat protesting bedtime. Here's the quirky tidbit. One satirical magazine joked that Victorian musical evenings should come with earplugs for the men and smelling salts for the ladies. In truth, some hosts kept professional performers in reserve, hidden among the guests, ready to rescue the mood if an amateur's efforts grew unbearable. Imagine hiring a tenor to casually step in after Cousin Harriet butchering Rule Britannia. Historians still argue whether these performances were sincere cultural highlights, or just thinly disguised auditions for marriage prospects. Was the piano a genuine stage for art, or a platform to demonstrate breeding, education, and pliant obedience? Accounts differ. Some recall transcendent evenings of music, while others recall endless parlor songs dragging on like overcooked mutton. The sensory details settle around you. The polished wood of the piano reflects candlelight as fingers stumble across ivory keys. Perfume mingles with the faint scent of smoke still clinging to the gentlemen's coats. Applause rises politely, hands tapping against gloves with a soft rustle rather than a hearty clap. The air is warm, heavy, and filled with the long sigh of another verse. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a weary guest leaning back and whispering, "If she plays one more nocturne, I'll be nocturnal forever." His neighbor smiles faintly and murmurs, "At least it's cheaper than counting sheep." By the time the final song ends, you feel as though you've survived yet another test, not of etiquette this time, but of endurance. The evening moves on toward its conclusion, yet even in farewell, Victorian etiquette insists that every gesture be measured, every word weighed, every cloak handed over with just the right flourish. The last notes of the piano fade, applause dwindles, and at last the evening leans toward its close. You might think goodbyes would be simple: coat, carriage, home, but this is a Victorian dinner party, and even departures are wrapped in etiquette as peculiar as any pudding fortress. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Lingering goodbyes were an expected part of dinner culture. Guests were not to rush out the door. Instead, they moved slowly toward the cloakroom, exchanging compliments, thanks, and polite observations about the evening. A hasty exit could be read as dissatisfaction, while an excessively long one risked testing the host's patience. The sweet spot was somewhere between graceful lingering and tactful retreat. You rise from your chair, thanking the hostess for her enchanting arrangements, and the host for his magnificent hospitality. These phrases feel rehearsed, almost incantatory, as though saying them in the wrong order might doom your next invitation. Around you, other guests perform the same ritual, men bowing slightly, women curtsying, voices pitched just loud enough to flatter but never enough to interrupt. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some households employed a servant whose unofficial job was to encourage departures by ever so gently dimming lamps or nudging cloaks forward. In one diary, a guest described standing in the hall complimenting the wallpaper for 15 minutes before realizing the butler had already tied his scarf for him. Imagine being ushered out mid-sentence with your muffler neatly knotted around your throat. Historians still argue whether these prolonged departures reflected genuine warmth or hollow formality. Were guests reluctant to leave because they enjoyed the company, or because the rules demanded it? Some claim this lingering was evidence of social cohesion. Others dismiss it as ritualistic padding to an already overlong evening. The sensory details of the departure are oddly poignant. The air smells of wax candles burned low, mixed with cigar smoke clinging to coats. Cloakroom attendants rustle fabric as they lift capes and wraps from hooks, while carriage wheels crunch faintly outside on gravel. Polite laughter floats in the hallway, rising and falling like the last embers of a fire. And here's your gentle joke, you imagine a guest whispering, "If I thank the wallpaper once more, it may start replying." His neighbor, tugging on gloves, murmurs, "Then it will host the next dinner." Finally, the front door opens, letting in the crisp night air. You step outside, cloak wrapped snugly, the lamps flickering against the damp cobblestones. Behind you, the murmur of farewells continues, like a lullaby for the house itself. And though the evening is over, you know that its life will continue tomorrow, replayed, dissected, and judged over breakfast tables all across the city. The carriage lamps are long gone from the street outside, but the echoes of the evening live on. Morning light slants through lace curtains, and you find yourself at a breakfast table where the real feast begins, not of meats and puddings, but of stories. The Victorian dinner party never truly ended at the door. It continued in gossip, dissections, and verdicts whispered over tea and toast the following day. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the morning after a grand dinner, society columns and drawing room chatter alike dissected every detail. Who sat where, who spoke with whom, and who violated the smallest etiquette rule. It wasn't uncommon for reputations to shift overnight, buoyed or bruised by what others had noticed and repeated. You sip tea while a friend recounts how Mrs. Fairfax wore a gown a season too late, or how the Colonel fumbled his fork during the fish course. Someone notes the pudding fortress's collapse with mock solemnity, as though it were a geopolitical disaster. Every stumble, every triumph becomes breakfast fodder, diced finely like marmalade spread across toast. Here's the quirky tidbit: some ambitious host actually hired reporters to mingle among guests and later plant glowing notices in newspapers. These were thinly veiled as society updates but essentially served as public relations, Victorian influencer marketing by way of puddings and port. One poor hostess, however, was immortalized in print when her jelly was described as quivering with as much instability as her family's fortune. Historians still argue whether this constant post-mortem chatter strengthened social networks or eroded them. Did it bind people together through shared stories, or create a culture of suspicion where every faux pas risked public exposure? Some insist it encouraged refinement, others see it as a form of endless surveillance. The sensory details of the morning are sharp in contrast to the evening before. Instead of candlelight and perfume, there's the smell of fresh bread, the soft clink of china cups, the rustle of newspapers being folded and flicked. The bright daylight exposes what shadows and gas lamps had softened, turning last night's grand illusions into fodder for gentle ridicule. And here's your gentle joke. You picture someone sighing over their tea. "I survived the soup without spilling a drop." Their companion smirks and replies, "Yes, but you'll never survive the gossip." By the time breakfast ends, you realize that the strange etiquette of Victorian dinner parties wasn't confined to the dining room at all. It seeped into mornings, lingered in conversations, and wrote itself into the very rhythm of social life. The meal may have ended, but the performance lived on, served cold over buttered toast. The story drifts to its end now, as softly as a candle guttering out. The long table is empty, the silver polished and put away, the chairs pushed back into silence. All that remains are echoes, the rustle of silk skirts, the quiet clink of glass, the polite laughter that hovered like perfume over every course. Let your mind soften, just as the morning softened the sharpness of last night. Picture the drawing rooms fading into stillness, the chandeliers dimmed, the gossip melting into quiet hums of memory. Imagine the velvet curtains swaying in a faint breeze, the smell of beeswax and rosewater dissolving into something gentler, something almost dreamlike. Breathe in, slowly, as though you are inhaling the perfume of a long-forgotten bouquet. Breathe out, just as slowly, like the sigh of a butler closing the front door at the very end of the night. Let your shoulders sink, your eyelids grow heavy, and your thoughts drift away from seating charts and silver spoons. The performance is over. The dinner is finished. What remains is calm, the calm of knowing you have survived every toast, every fork, every glance across the table. You are safe now, cradled not by etiquette, but by quiet. So rest gently. Let yourself float away as though reclining in a velvet chair, the hum of voices fading into silence, the glow of candles slipping into shadow. The party is over, and the night is yours.